Before we begin, a quick note about how this episode was created. This episode uses AI-generated narration to bring Dr. Jackal's voice and character to life. However, the ideas, framing, and wording are my own. Dr. Alyssa R. Jones. The content has been synthesized, paraphrased, and adapted from history of psychology textbooks, scholarly work, lectures, professors, and other educational resources that have shaped my understanding of psychology, science, philosophy, and the mind. AI is used as a creative teaching tool, but the educational interpretation, organization, and teaching perspective come from me. Some wording may be condensed or adapted for clarity, accessibility, and narrative flow. This episode is designed to support learning, discussion, and historical engagement, and to invite students into the ideas, not replace the original sources. Welcome back to Dr. Jackal's History and Systems of Psychology podcast, where we trace the strange, brilliant, and occasionally messy road that made psychology into a science. I'm Dr. Jackal, your lab mascot guide through the horses, puzzle boxes, salivating dogs, reflexes, arguments, and very confident manifestos that helped psychology become obsessed with observable behavior. Today's lesson: a horse, some cats in puzzle boxes, and salivating dogs helped move psychology toward behaviorism, as one does. In this episode, we are not just memorizing a timeline. We are tracking how psychologists changed what counted as evidence, what counted as science, and what counted as the mind in the first place. Last time, we talked about applied psychology, mental testing, and the measurement of human difference. Psychology was becoming more practical, more public, and more interested in prediction and control. Today, that focus on objectivity gets even stronger. Psychology turns toward animal learning, conditioned reflexes, observable behavior, and eventually the behaviorist revolution. Before Watson storms in and tells psychology to stop talking about consciousness, several figures help prepare the ground. And weirdly enough, one of the most important characters in that story is a horse. Part 1. Clever Hans, the horse who made psychology behave. In the early 1900s, nearly everyone in Europe and the United States had heard of Clever Hans, the Wonder Horse. Hans was believed to have numerical reasoning ability, comparable to that of a typical 14-year-old boy. He appeared to be able to add and subtract. He could supposedly use fractions and decimals. He could read. He could identify coins. He could play card games. He could spell. He could recognize objects. He could even perform feats of memory, which, frankly, is more than some of us can do before coffee. Hans's owner, Wilhelm von Osten, had spent years teaching him the fundamentals of human intelligence. Importantly, von Osten did not seem to be motivated by money. He had scientific motives. He wanted to prove that Darwin was right about humans and animals having similar mental processes. Von Osten believed that animals did not appear intelligent simply because they had not received sufficient education. He thought the horse, especially, could show that animals were intelligent beings. But many people doubted him. And that doubt turned out to be important, because the case of Clever Hans helped demonstrate the value of an experimental approach to animal behavior. Hans was not actually doing arithmetic in the human sense. Instead, he was responding to subtle, often unconscious cues from the people around him. When Hans tapped his hoof, observers would unintentionally change their posture, breathing, facial expression, or tension as he approached the correct answer. Hans learned to stop tapping when those cues appeared. So Hans was not solving math problems, but he was learning. And that is the key point. Clever Hans showed that animal behavior could be shaped by environmental cues in ways people did not even realize. The case also warned psychologists against anthropomorphic interpretation. Just because behavior looks intelligent does not mean it reflects the same mental process a human would use. Hans helped move psychology toward more careful observation, better controls, and more objective explanations of animal learning. The horse did not prove that horses can do algebra, but he did help psychology behave. Part 2. Animal psychology sets the stage. Behaviorism is directly related to animal psychology. In many ways, behaviorism grew out of it. Watson's psychology was deeply shaped by animal research, and animal psychology itself grew out of evolutionary theory. Remember, Darwin's work raised the possibility of continuity between human and animal minds. If humans and animals evolved from common ancestors, then perhaps animal behavior could teach us something about human behavior. Early animal psychologists tried to demonstrate the existence of mind in lower organisms. They wanted to show continuity between animal and human mental processes. But as psychology became more objective, the focus shifted. Instead of asking whether animals had consciousness like humans, psychologists increasingly studied observable behavior. What does the animal do? What stimuli affect it? How does it learn? How does its behavior change with experience? Once psychology's subject matter shifted from consciousness to overt behavior, animal psychology became more objective and more valuable to the developing field. This shift helped prepare the way for Watson. Watson called for a psychology that was scientific and dealt only with observable behavior. He wanted behavior described in terms of stimulus and response. He rejected mentalistic concepts and terms. His behaviorism combined several traditions: the philosophical tradition of objectivism and mechanism, animal psychology, and functional psychology. Together, these gave Watson the materials he needed to build behavioral psychology. But before Watson, several other figures were already moving psychology in that direction. Part 3. Jacques Loeb and Tropisms. One important figure was Jacques Loeb, a German physiologist and zoologist. Loeb rejected the anthropomorphic tradition and the use of introspection in animal psychology. He developed a theory of animal behavior based on tropism. A tropism is an involuntary, forced movement in response to a stimulus. Loeb believed that an animal's reaction to a stimulus is direct and automatic. In his view, the behavioral response is forced by the stimulus and does not require explanation in terms of the animal's consciousness. This is a strongly mechanistic approach. The organism responds to environmental forces almost like a machine. Stimulus in, movement out. That kind of thinking helped move psychology away from speculation about animal minds and toward observable behavior. Now, Loeb did not completely reject consciousness in higher animals or humans. He believed animal consciousness could be revealed through associative memory. Associative memory meant animals had learned to react to certain stimuli in useful or desirable ways. So even with his mechanistic approach, Loeb still invoked consciousness at times. But his emphasis on automatic response and objective explanation helped prepare psychology for behaviorism. Part 4. Other animal psychologists before behaviorism. Several other figures helped animal psychology become central to the field. Robert Yerkes began animal studies in 1900, and his research strengthened the position of comparative psychology. Charles Henry Turner also made important contributions. Turner published an article called A Preliminary Note on Ant Behavior, which Watson praised. Watson even used the term behavior in his review of Turner's article, taking it from Turner's title. Turner published a large amount of research on comparative psychology in psychological journals. Because of that, some psychologists have claimed him as one of their own within the history of comparative psychology. Another important figure was Margaret Floy Washburn. Washburn was Titchener's first doctoral student, and she taught animal psychology at Cornell. Her book, The Animal Mind, was the first comparative psychology textbook published in the United States. In that work, Washburn continued to attribute consciousness to animals. She also continued the method of introspecting the animal mind by analogy with the human mind. So Washburn still belonged partly to an older tradition. She believed animal minds could be studied, but she also continued to use mentalistic language. Her book marked the end of an era. Animal psychology was about to become more objective, and behaviorism was about to take over. Part 5. Thorndike's Connectionism. Now we turn to Edward Lee Thorndike. Thorndike called his experimental approach to the study of association connectionism. He believed that learning involves forming connections. According to Thorndike, if we could analyze the human mind, we would find connections of varying strength between situations and responses. He said learning is connecting. The mind is a connection system. But Thorndike's connectionism was different from older associationism. Older associationism focused on connections among ideas. Thorndike focused on connections between objectively verifiable situations and responses. That is a major shift. He was not asking people to introspect about ideas. He was studying observable situations and observable behavior. His approach belonged to the mechanistic tradition. He argued that behavior should be reduced to its simplest elements, stimulus-response units. Like structuralists who tried to find the elements of consciousness, Thorndike looked for the elements of behavior. But for him, those elements were not sensations or images. They were stimulus-response connections. Part 6. The Law of Effect and the Law of Exercise. Thorndike is especially famous for his laws of learning. The first is the Law of Effect. The Law of Effect states that acts producing satisfaction in a given situation become associated with that situation. When the situation occurs again, the act is more likely to recur. In other words, if a response leads to a satisfying outcome, that response becomes more likely in the future. Thorndike described this as the stamping in of a response tendency. Responses that do not produce satisfaction may be stamped out. Thorndike also proposed the law of exercise, or the law of use and disuse. This law states that any response made in a particular situation becomes associated with that situation. The more often a response is used in that situation, the more strongly it becomes associated with it. And if the response is not used for a long time, the association weakens. So practice strengthens connections. Disuse weakens them. However, Thorndike eventually placed more emphasis on consequences than on mere repetition. The reward or consequence of a response was more effective than just repeating the response. He also found that punishment did not produce an equally strong negative effect. In other words, rewards seem more powerful for learning than punishments. That point matters because it foreshadows later debates about reinforcement, punishment, and learning. Thorndike helped move psychology toward observable learning, objective methods, and the experimental study of behavior. Part 7, Pavlov and the Conditioned Reflex. Now we arrive at Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov worked on three major problems across his career. First, he studied the function of nerves on the heart. Second, he studied the primary digestive glands. Third, he studied conditioned reflexes. That third area is why Pavlov earned such an important place in the history of psychology. Pavlov originally called these conditioned reflexes psychic reflexes. They were reflexes aroused in laboratory dogs by stimuli other than the original natural stimulus. At first, Pavlov was interested in the mental experiences of his laboratory animals. This may have reflected the broader zeitgeist in animal psychology. He wrote about animals' desires, judgments, and will. He interpreted their mental events in subjective and human terms. But later, Pavlov dropped that mentalistic language in favor of a more objective and descriptive approach. In his work on conditioned reflexes, Pavlov gave credit to René Descartes for developing the idea of the reflex centuries earlier. Pavlov saw Descartes' concept of the nervous reflex as a starting point for his own research program. Pavlov's famous discovery came from his studies of digestion. He found that dogs naturally salivated when food was placed in their mouths. That response did not require learning. It was a natural, reflexive response of the digestive system. Pavlov called this an unconditioned reflex. But then he noticed something else. After repeated experiences in the lab, dogs began salivating before food was placed in their mouths. They might salivate at the sight of the food, or at the sight of the person bringing the food, or in response to other stimuli associated with feeding. That response was learned. Pavlov called it a conditioned reflex because it depended on the conditions under which the dog formed an association between the stimulus and food. Part 8. Conditioning in the laboratory. Pavlov and his assistants discovered that many stimuli could produce conditioned salivation, as long as the stimulus attracted the animal's attention and did not evoke strong negative emotional responses. For example, a light could be paired with food. At first, the light alone would not produce salivation, but after repeated pairings of the light and food, the dog would salivate when the light appeared by itself. An association had formed between the light and the food. The light became the conditioned stimulus. The salivation to the light became the conditioned response. Pavlov's work required precision. He wanted tight scientific control. He did not want outside influences affecting the reliability of his research. So he designed special cubicles. One cubicle housed the experimental animal, another housed the experimenter. The researcher could vary stimuli, collect saliva, and present food without being seen by the animal. Pavlov even designed a 3-story laboratory called the Tower of Silence. It was built to keep out vibration, noise, temperature extremes, odors, and drafts. That is commitment. Most of us close one office door and feel accomplished. Pavlov built a tower. His goal was to standardize experimental conditions, apply rigorous controls, and eliminate sources of error. Pavlov demonstrated that higher mental processes in animal subjects could be described in physiological terms without mentioning consciousness. His conditioning methods later influenced many areas of psychology, including behavior therapy. They also reinforced psychology's shift toward objectivity in both subject matter and method. Most importantly for our story, Pavlov provided psychology with a basic unit of behavior. Watson would recognize the conditioned reflex as a core element of behaviorism. Part 9. Twittmeyer and the Discovery That Got Ghosted. Now we pause for one of psychology's great, almost famous stories, Edwin Burkitt Twittmeyer. In 1904, Twittmeyer presented his dissertation research on the knee-jerk reflex at the APA convention. His work involved something very close to conditioned reflexes, but no one at the meeting seemed interested. His findings were ignored. Twitmeyer became discouraged and did not continue pursuing the work. There may be several reasons he was ignored. Maybe the zeitgeist in American psychology was not ready for the conditioned reflex. Maybe he was too young and inexperienced. Maybe he lacked the professional status, social connections, or economic resources needed to publicize and defend his ideas. Whatever the reason, Twitmeyer became one of those figures history almost forgets. Many historians describe him as a scientist who could have become famous for making one of psychology's most important discoveries. Twitmeyer matters because he reminds us that history is selective. It is not only about who has the idea, it is also about who gets heard, who has status, who has timing, who has resources, who has the right audience, who fits the zeitgeist. Sometimes science ignores a discovery because the field is not ready for it. Sometimes the knock comes too early. The zeitgeist does not answer the door. Part 10. Bekhterev and Motor Conditioning. Another important figure was Vladimir Bekhterev. Bekhterev helped move animal psychology away from subjective ideas and toward objectively observed behavior. He and Pavlov were rivals, and at one point they became enemies after Pavlov published a negative review of Bekhtérev's work. Academic beef, older than Twitter. Pavlov focused on glandular secretions, especially salivation. Bekhterev was interested in motor conditioning. In a sense, he applied conditioning principles to the muscles. Bekhterev studied what he called associated reflexes. These are reflexes that can be elicited not only by unconditioned stimuli, but also by stimuli that have become associated with the unconditioned stimuli. He believed these responses were reflexive. He also thought more complex higher-level behaviors could be explained the same way, as accumulations or combinations of lower-level motor reflexes. Bekhterev argued for a completely objective approach to psychological phenomena. He opposed mentalistic terms and concepts. He described his ideas in objective psychology, also known as general principles of human reflexology. His work helped push psychology toward overt behavior and away from consciousness. Animal psychology was quickly becoming the model for behaviorism, and animals were becoming the preferred subjects for psychological research. Part 11. Functionalism hands the baton to behaviorism. Functional psychology was not completely objective. Functionalists still talked about consciousness, purpose, adaptation, and mental activity. But by Watson's time, functionalism had become much more objective than earlier systems. Many scientists opposed introspection. Many emphasized behavior and objectivity. Applied psychologists had little use for introspection or consciousness because their work focused on practical outcomes. Their specialties essentially formed a kind of objective functional psychology. Functional psychologists had already moved away from a pure psychology of conscious experience before Watson appeared. Some even called for an explicitly objective psychology focused on behavior rather than consciousness. So before behaviorism officially arrived, the intellectual climate in the United States already favored objective psychology. The overall movement was toward the idea that psychology should study observable behavior. Several figures contributed to this shift. Walter Pillsbury argued that it was possible to treat human beings as objective aspects of the physical universe. Max Meyer published The Fundamental Laws of Human Behavior. William McDougall wrote Psychology, the Study of Behavior in 1912. Knight Dunlap suggested that psychology should ban introspection. William Montague presented a paper titled, Has Psychology Lost Its Mind?, at the APA conference. In that paper, he spoke of eliminating the concept of mind or consciousness and substituting behavior as the sufficient object of psychological study. Even J.R. Angel, one of the major functional psychologists, predicted that American psychology was ready for greater objectivity. He suggested that the term consciousness might disappear from psychology, just as the term soul had disappeared earlier. Angel even argued that it might be useful if consciousness were forgotten and both animal and human behavior were described objectively instead. So Watson was not the first person to propose objective psychology. That is important. Watson did not invent the entire movement from nowhere, but he saw clearly what the times were calling for. He responded boldly and articulately. That made him the agent of a revolution whose success was almost assured because it had already begun. The zeitgeist had prepared the stage. Watson was about to walk onto it with a megaphone. Part 12. Pulling it all together. So let's pull this episode together animal psychology helped prepare the way for behaviorism. Clever Hans showed psychologists the danger of assuming human-like intelligence too quickly and the importance of controlled observation. Loeb emphasized automatic mechanistic responses to stimuli. Yerkes and Turner strengthened comparative psychology. Washburn's The Animal Mind marked the end of an older era that still attributed consciousness to animals. Thorndike showed that learning could be studied experimentally through stimulus-response connections and consequences. Pavlov demonstrated conditioned reflexes and showed how learned responses could be studied physiologically and objectively. Twitmeyer reminded us that being right is not always enough to be remembered. Bekhterev pushed conditioning toward motor responses and a fully objective psychology. Functionalism, applied psychology, and American pragmatism all helped shift psychology toward usefulness, prediction, and observable behavior. By the time Watson announced behaviorism, the field was already moving in that direction. Behaviorism did not appear out of thin air. It emerged from animal learning, reflex research, functionalism, applied psychology, objectivism, mechanism, and the American hunger for practical science. Psychology was changing again. The mind was being pushed out. Behavior was moving to the center. The big takeaway from today's episode is that psychology changed through argument, measurement, method, and cultural pressure. The names matter. Clever Hans matters. Loeb matters. Yerkes matters. Turner matters. Washburn matters. Thorndike matters. Pavlov matters. Twitmeyer matters. Bekhterev matters. Angel matters. Watson is waiting in the wings. But the pattern matters more. Each figure or movement is responding to a problem left behind by the last one. Animal psychologists wanted to understand animal minds. Experimentalists demanded better evidence. Thorndike turned learning into observable connections. Pavlov turned reflexes into a rigorous laboratory science. Functionalism made psychology practical and adaptive. Applied psychology made psychology useful and public, and all of this prepared the way for behaviorism. Next time, Watson storms in and says psychology has lost its mind. And he means that as a plan. Dr. Jackal is signing off for now. The past has spoken, the methods are still on trial, and the next episode is already waiting in the wings.